Well, hello and welcome. This session is being recorded. My name is Dr. Gloria Washington, and I will be your moderator for this ADEIL conference session. And before we begin, on behalf of ADEIL, we'd like to thank our generous sponsor, Noodle, and our host, Old Dominion University. And we are thankful for their contributions in making this event possible. I will be randomly selecting a person from this session to win one of the conference giveaways, some ADEIL swag. And so I'm going to post the winner of this session. And the winner of this session is Jenny Hopkins. Hopefully I said your name correctly. And if you can put your email address in the chat area so I can pull that so that we can contact you about getting your giveaway to you. And please help me welcome Dr. Brandon Martínez.
Greetings all, super happy to be here. Just so you know, this session is a repeat of what I just did the last session. So if you were thinking this was a part two, it's not, but I don't see anybody from the first time, so it should be good to go. The other thing is, as we're going, I will try to be mindful of the chat. By all means, use it to pose questions, ask ideas. If I miss it, Dr. Washington will ping me and call it out, but I'll try to be intentional and kind of pause and check that as we go. Also, we'll be using a poll a couple of times. It's going to be just a basic 4-point Likert scale, but the items you'll respond to will actually be on my slide. So we'll just kind of use, rinse, and relaunch if that works for everyone. So let's go ahead and get started. I would like to begin by saying most of what I'm going to share today is going to be from the perspective of a faculty lens. I've been a faculty member at the University of Southern California, Rossier School of Ed since 2009. I also work for Noodle. I'm part of our learning team. But what I want to share is really about helping faculty in the room or those that work with faculty really start thinking about how can we embrace AI in terms of what we do from a teaching standpoint, so our pedagogy, as well as how it influences learning design for our courses, be it a fully on-ground, in-person, synchronous experience, or to the opposite spectrum, which is fully online, asynchronous, and of course, everything in between there. So really that's the faculty lens that I'll wear. Key points, just a quick discussion around the idea that disruption really is not new. I've got a couple of examples that I think will help illustrate that. Jumping into some ways to think about our own teaching practice, our learning design, and then really want to spend some time sharing with you an experiment that I conducted that was my way of kind of getting my toe in the water in terms of possibilities of how I might use AI in my own practice. And then we'll close out with, I'm using air quotes around the framework because it's not really a research-based framework, but almost more like a checklist of things you can think about from a faculty perspective as you jump into this. So I'd like us to get our minds thinking about our own dispositions and thoughts around AI. So here's the first question. I'll have the poll up here in a couple seconds. It is this: I am confident in my understanding of what AI is and how it works. Again, I'm confident of my understanding of what AI is and how it works. So let me go ahead and launch this poll. And again, you respond the way you feel is best for you. There you go. I'm confident in my understanding of what AI is and how it works. Awesome. We're at about 80% responding. And I'll give it about 3 more seconds. 3, 2, 1, and take a look at these results. So pretty decent distribution. Definitely more on the side of agree to strongly agree. So I think that's super important. It's like, do we understand fundamentally how this thing works? Second item is this. And then this is you as a practitioner. I regularly use AI to create content for my course. When we say content, it could be anything from I built a whole course to I used it to create an assessment, and again, anything in between there. I regularly use AI to create content for my course. That was the response from our last poll, and let me relaunch this one. Okay, I regularly use AI to create content for my course. We're at 60% response, slowly growing. Okay, close it in about 5 seconds. Okay, here we go. So a much different distribution. So clearly have some fundamental understanding of what AI is and how it works. On the actual practitioner side, kind of spread out. And that's totally normal, totally fine. But as far as like figuring out like who's in the room and sort of what's our lived experience, I think that's important to see that. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into a couple ideas. First one is the argument or the assertion that disruption really is not new, right? I think we can think of many examples of where there's been disruption through innovation that at the time it comes onto the scene, we've got thoughts about how it's going to ruin the world or how it's going to be the greatest thing. We come up with lists and ideas for each of those categories. And when that innovation is no longer in its disruptive status and we sort of reconciled that, we can look back and realize, yeah, half the things that we came up with about doomsday were wrong. Half of the things that we said were going to be great were wrong. And then some stuff emerges that we just didn't even think about. And then we sort of move on. I think we're definitely at one of those points. And just to kind of think back from a historical standpoint, there was a time when the written word was literally written by hand and you could not make mistakes. You had the illuminated text. And if you messed up, you had to start over. It was slow. It was laborious. We had a highly illiterate society, and the dissemination of the written word was really for just the rich and the privileged. And you might have 1 or 2 copies of a particular text, but that was kind of it, right? Then lo and behold, we get the Gutenberg press, which was a major game changer. Expedited the production pace, but also the distribution and access to literature and reading. And then suddenly you see literacy rates change. But at the time of this arrival, I am sure there were folks that said, we're going to lose the art of writing. We're going to lose the sacredness of, the written word. And should we really provide information in this different kind of format? And there were probably an equal number of ideas about how it's going to be the greatest thing in the world. And as we just sort of fast forward through history, we moved on to the typewriter, we moved on to the word processor, and we now have multiple ways that we use the written word, even with speech to text, so on and so forth. And we don't think twice about it now. It didn't kill us. It didn't ruin us. Many, many affordances. And I'm sure most students are glad that they're not writing stuff out by hand, or they're having to chisel something into a clay tablet or illuminate it, right? Right. Same idea around the internet, right? And again, I'm saying this quote as sort of tongue in cheek. Someone at some point probably said, yeah, the internet will ruin the world. Here's the things it's going to, do to ruin us. Here are the things that's going to be great. Same kind of idea as we've moved through Web 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. We've seen it all. We've seen hacking, we've seen cyber attacks, but we've also seen tremendous benefit that has come. And we're probably at the point now where we no longer think of the internet as like a major disruption because it's now part of our everyday use. And as iterations happen on it, those might be spikes of innovation, but certainly not disruptive innovation in the way that we think about AI. So back to some of the thinking about your thoughts in terms of your practices. I believe there are more detriments to using AI in my courses or my course than benefits. I believe there are more detriments to using AI in my course or courses than there are benefits. What are your thoughts about that? And again, if you're not currently teaching a course, how would you feel about this if you were? Give it a couple more seconds. All right. Take a look at the results. And again, about 12 folks, the majority feel like no, I don't think there are more detriments. Do you think there's more affordances? And then a few folks that think the other way. And again, totally normal. Agree that this is a novel space. There's still a lot of the unknown. And then one more item is now thinking about your own particular use is I am knowledgeable of different strategies for using AI in my course. So if you think about your current practice, have you already done some of these things? Or if you were going to start tomorrow, do you feel like you have a pretty good idea of some different ways that you might use it? So again, I am knowledgeable of different strategies for using AI in my course. And let's go ahead and launch this one. And the poll is open. I am knowledgeable of different strategies for using AI in my course. And we'll close this one in about 5 seconds. 3, 2, 1, awesome. Oh, got one more in there. Okay, here we go. Take a look. Okay, again, pretty decent distribution. We've got a couple folks on the outlier responses, and then everything sort of merges in the middle. And again, we're not gonna test anyone. This is again your self-reported idea and your self-reported efficacy. So I'm gonna put up a question, and I would love to have a couple folks, jump in and give your perspective on how you're thinking about this. And here's the question: what are the current beliefs, fears, resistance, and unknowns about the role of AI in teaching in higher ed? So it could be any of these. What do faculty currently believe about this? What are faculty fears? What are some reasons that faculty are resisting this? What might be some of the unknowns in terms of AI and its role in our own teaching? And we could probably add on there even in our own course design. I'm going to stop share just so I can see folks, but if we could get couple to jump in, would love to hear your thoughts and ideas.
It's difficult for me to know where to start. There's so many resources and wikis and, so much stuff. I'm not sure where to start with the limited amount of time I have.
Yeah, appreciate that, right? There's so much coming at us, right? What is really a good starting spot? Is it a wiki? Is it a friend? Is it one of the company's sites? Yeah, so very difficult to start. Whereas if we were, going to decide to pick up fishing or cooking, we probably, narrow ourselves to a starting point. Other thoughts, fears, resistance. What are some of the concerns about AI being integrated into higher ed? Natasha's got a comment in the chat, so if you all would like to take a look at that. Yeah, good point. So intellectual property, like how do we sort of account for that, right? Are there citations showing up when we've got ideas generated, or if there are images or music or other things, like how are we really accounting for that? Even our own originally created stuff, does it get put into the wash? Any others that want to share an idea? Awesome. We got a couple others. Take a look what Beth and Dr. Washington have written. Yeah, right. Even, when Twitter was Twitter, tweets were essentially public domain, and now almost like anything we do from a data trail can some way be put out, into the public, or at least are stored someplace. And I love that Dr. Washington has put that comment, because I actually have it a little bit later about the fears of, are we going to be replaced? Let's give it like 10 more seconds to read a few more of these from Ralton down to Yvonne real quickly. And then we're going to just look at a couple of ideas and see how these resonate. All right. Now, this list is not exhaustive, but these are things that I've seen through either universities sharing through their centers for excellence in teaching, or their public-facing websites, or other units on the campus, as well as some of the things in the different trade magazines. So first and foremost, plagiarism in its many forms. It's now just a tool to write essays. You've all probably heard that one, that we're going to lose the ability to teach students how to write because they'll just have it create that. Replacing faculty, Dr. Washington hit this one, like that's a genuine fear. Is like, if it could do all these things, then why am I needed? Do I get replaced? What about even at the larger scale, right? Does the traditional university pathway remain, or is there sort of this AI version of a university? And then some of the other things that were mentioned, data security in all its forms, even if it's not a breach, does my personal data get put out there? It's super expensive. We'll probably talk a little bit later about just the notion of access and equity of, if it's a paid subscription, do all students get access to this? Rapidly changing. And we can also throw in other things that were mentioned, like, the intellectual property issue. So as we think about embarking in this space and I use it, how am I being mindful to mitigate plagiarism, making sure that I'm still, as a faculty member, a viable part of this experience, that we're maintaining the integrity of universities, and a slew of all these other issues that come into place. So that's kind of on the teaching side, right? And tightly coupled with this is what we do in terms of our own course design, whether that course design is about an on-ground, fully synchronous, bound by time and physical location, or on the opposite end, and it's a fully asynchronous sort of self-guided course, and then anything that falls in between there. So get a couple more thoughts on this. I cannot explain how AI can be used in the learning design process. I cannot explain how AI can be used in the learning design process. Sorry, my polls has got a little bit of a delay here. There you go. I cannot explain how AI can be used in the learning design process. Also, while the vote's happening, I do want to read one comment Natasha put in that I think spot on, and we'll hit on this a little bit later, which is the outputs of AI are often inaccurate. And if an expert is not carefully checking it, there is the danger of disseminating incorrect information, like fully spot on. So I think that's another one we can add, is like, just because I get an output, does that mean I can throw it in my class? No. All right, so let's take a look. Again, pretty decent distribution of responses from some that disagree and are like, yep, I know how to use AI for course design, to a few they're like, not sure yet. And again, no problem at all. That's kind of why we're here, is to think about where we sit relative to this. Okay, I'm gonna jump to a quote, and this is from an article I just recently read in The Atlantic. Ross Anderson is a writer there, and he spent several days at the OpenAI headquarters and kind of followed their founder around a bit, and wrote this piece that's in, I think it's in the September issue. I actually still get the hard version as well as the digital version. But I thought this was interesting in terms of like reinforcing the idea of like, we don't necessarily know where it's going, but also as it's being developed, this is one of the situations, which is we come up with really clear defined models. We've got some training data that we're giving in this algorithm, yet sometimes the AI models veer left, veer right, and come out of that with actually some unanticipated abilities, right? Well, conversely, you might think, okay, if those are abilities that we find to be, beneficial and good, can the opposite happen? And I think the answer is yes. So being mindful of that as well. So we've talked about pedagogy, we've talked about learning design. I stop at this model just to get us to think about faculty dispositions across a department, or those that are teaching a specific degree, or all the way up to the full university, which is you are typically going to get, and I'm sharing this now from my work with Noodle, having worked with dozens of universities who have put their on-ground degrees into the online space, worked with many programs. What I've typically found, whether it's a social work degree, an MBA, nursing, like you name it, there's usually one faculty member, and sometimes it's the program director, who is absolutely bleeding edge innovator that I want to follow that person and learn from them. On the opposite end, there's usually an equal, maybe a couple more that are like, going online is the dumbest thing ever. It's terrible. Students won't learn. The dean's making us do this. And then everybody else kind of falls in the middle, right? From the early adopters to the majority to the late majority. That is likely what we are encountering with faculty based on their prior experience, based on years of service, is this is the reality of what we're facing. So how do we help folks from maybe the late majority move up a spot, from early majority move up a spot, and particularly our laggards, so that when students are going through a program, they're not encountering the one innovator faculty member in one class, and then they get a class that has some laggards, and then they get a class that, like, how are we giving them an experience that is reciprocal maybe to their own experience? And of course, accounting for students who could actually fall on this spectrum of like, hey, I'm a career changer. I've been out of higher ed or education in general for a decade. I might be more of a late majority versus students that maybe go right from an undergrad to a grad program that might be on that other end. So there is a reciprocal relation of how do we level set and how do we help get folks on board to move forward with this? And what are the dangers if we don't? Well, this is a well-known example, right? That if we don't innovate, if we don't move on with the times, we can become the Blockbusters of the world. So there was a time when Blockbuster was it was the top, video rental place, but because they lost their eye and focus on innovation, they have fallen by the wayside. I use this as sort of an analog for us, which is, this is not like a bump in the road innovation. This is pretty significant. How are we now thinking about ways that we can use it in our own teaching and learning design to make that happen? Real quick story that I think further illustrates this is in 2009, I defended my dissertation in online learning. I was a student at USC, and right at that time, our dean had this idea to put the Master of Arts in Teaching into an online program. And just about everybody at Ross Sear and other surrounding schools are like, there's no way you can teach students to become a teacher through online means. The only way it can happen is they got to be in the classroom, and faculty have to go to their teaching assignment locations to observe them teaching in real time, to evaluate them. There's no way this is going to happen. It's a terrible idea. I get hired to be really the first faculty member in that online space. And we started with 50 students. And there were a whole lot of things that we did really well. There were a whole lot of things that we missed. And there was stuff that we discovered that we didn't think about. Fast forward to 2023. If you're a school of ed and you're not online, like, you are in that laggard spot, and likely your enrollment is dipping. My point being is, this is a similar iteration that we're going through, which is this thing called AI has emerged. There's probably a lot of doubts. It's probably very disruptive in terms of what we're comfortable with and where the norm is. But by experimenting, by getting smart people in the room, there's ways to iterate on that. And I use this just as one of probably many examples that folks can think of how that's worked. One other example that's just come out of a study that's about to start between USC and the Los Angeles Police Department is taking thousands of hours of body cam footage for traffic stops. So when an officer pulls over a vehicle for a traffic stop and it's recorded, leveraging AI to analyze thousands of hours of footage to come up with some ideas for training models. So does the output help us see where things are not going well, or where officers can be better in those interactions? That really could not happen on a human scale unless you actually have people watching thousands and thousands of hours of footage and then trying to get them together to do that evaluation. While this is not a higher rate example, I'm thinking of what could this analog be? Is it a way to look at student experience, student assessment, our own faculty practices? Is there a way to capture some of that data and then get some results that could help us guide what could be better? Okay, let's jump now into the experiment that I embarked on. I was curious like anybody else, and I thought, how could I use AI to maybe ideate in a way that would be much faster than if I were to try to build a course on my own or even with a colleague? So there's 4 things I did, and I'm actually show you the actual output. I asked it to create some course outcomes for an undergraduate accounting course. I asked what would be the assessments for each of those particular outcomes. I thought of, well, case studies are often part of MBA experiences. What would be an idea for a case study that would map back to those outcomes? And lastly, if I honed in on one specific learning outcome, what's a way that I could be sure that students were competent in that learning outcome versus just having, let's say, factual or conceptual knowledge? So let's jump to my actual experience doing this. And this is my actual transaction with ChatGPT 3. As you can see, I opened up with this question. And I wasn't very polite. I just kind of gave a command. And I wasn't using the instructions, so it didn't have like my persona. I just said, create 10 learning outcomes for an intro. So I got these 10. And being an educational psychologist by trade, mostly in the cognitive sciences, I'm a Bloom's taxonomy geek. I look at Bloom's all the time. There's a site I'll share in a bit that's at Iowa State that has the Bloom's Revised, which is the Anderson and Krathwohl work. So it takes the 6 Bloom's cognitive processes, couples them with 4 knowledge domains. And I evaluated these. And my only knock on these was, in many of the cases, they just used the name of the category, right? And Bloom argued in his work, as well as Anderson and Krathwohl, that don't use the name of the category when you're writing an outcome. Use one of the synonyms, because the synonym is going to be much more specific. That aside, as I looked at these, and I'm not an accountant, but I feel like I can evaluate learning objectives pretty well, I gave this 2 thumbs up. Like, these were pretty sound, and they also covered a range of cognitive processes, from low-hanging fruit, like remember, understand, all the way to apply and create. And my checklist was using this site right here. And I'm going to put this in the chat, and then I'll screen share, just to make sure that I didn't, hypothetically take that outcomes that it produced and just threw it onto a course. I did my due diligence and I evaluated it. So just as a quick reference, this is the Bloom site. There are other schools that have something similar, but this is one I've used for a long time. So these are the Bloom's cognitive processes. Again, Bloom would argue, don't use the name of the category title, use one of the synonyms that's much more specific. And then this is where Anderson and Krathwohl added their take, which was the 4 knowledge dimensions. So if you look at it from a matrix standpoint, for every learning outcome, you've got a cognitive process, which would be the left side, coupled with a knowledge type. So I just share that as a side note, so you know, like, what I did personally in terms of evaluating and vetting what the outcome was. Okay, so at that point, I felt like, okay, those are pretty good. My next question was, well, great, how would I know if students actually learned these pieces? What are some assessment ideas for this list? And I thought it's just going to give me like pretty lame multiple choice matching. Nope, it actually covered a wide range of tasks. And back to some of our earlier concerns of, well, they can just generate a plagiarized essay, or they're going to become passive. Some of these will not allow that. Like, they actually are the doing of the task. So you can see from simple multiple choice true false all the way down to ethical dilemmas, to even some soft skill pieces such as a presentation and communication. Again, each of these mapping back to reasonably assess what would those outcomes be. So at that point, again, using my background in assessment, again, comparing them back to the Blooms, I thought, yeah, this is pretty decent stuff. Now, quick timeout. None of these assessments are written. So I didn't ask it to give me 20 multiple choice items. I didn't ask it to create the financial statement analysis. My whole goal was, can I expedite the ideation process so that I've got something to start with and I can sort of pick and choose and then figure out what's there. If I had a colleague with me or two, same idea. But at this point, I still would need to do the work of creating what I would want it to be based on my teaching experience, my student experience, fidelity to the curriculum, so on and so forth. And that's not to say I couldn't leverage it for that, but in terms of my little experiment, that was just what I was trying to do. Okay, so learning outcomes, assessment, and then I thought, well, from an ethical dilemma and from a business school, case studies are pretty popular. What might be an idea around how I can use a case study so that students can engage with this content, and what outcomes would it align with? Well, in this case, it came up with a hypothetical ABC electronics case idea and narrowed it to 4 outcomes. I really thought it was going to try to map it back to all 10. It didn't. It gave me 4, which is reasonable, right? Not going to try to use a case study for the whole course, but maybe for this segment. It gave me a scenario, right? And then it gave me what would be the possible tasks. And again, this scenario is not the full case. It's just the idea. I might now create and iterate and add some nuances to it. And in terms of the tasks for students, it didn't create the calculation of financial ratios problem. It just gave the idea. So I might create some very specific worked examples that students would do. Or for a financial statement analysis, maybe I do create one for ABC electronics, or I create one for like a different sector. But again, as far as what I was trying to do, can it give me an idea for a case study as a starting point for ideation? And what are some things I might have students do in tandem with that? That's where my tasks for students list came about. The last thing I did, and then I'm mindful that the chat has some comments popping in. I honed in on one learning outcome, and I think I just kind of randomly picked number 4. And I just said, what can a learner do to demonstrate competency in learning outcome 4 above, which is this. Go ahead and read this right here. This is outcome number 4. And you can see by the verb, it is an apply. We should probably use a synonym, but that to me was not just recalling the definitions of accounting terms, not explaining the concept of an accounting term. It's actually the doing of it. What would this have me do? And so it came up with these 8 ideas, each of which should be a way students could demonstrate competency for that particular learning outcome. So that was my experiment. My point of sharing that with all of you is that's one way to get in the sandbox, right? We didn't break anything. That did not appear in a course. I don't teach accounting, but I could have used it for my accountability or my ed psych class I teach, but I haven't yet, and I wouldn't put it out there. But my goal was, can I use it as a thought partner? Should I have to start a course from blank? Or could I take my existing content and riff back and forth on ways I might improve it, how I might change it? Is the scope and sequence of my course, does it make sense? Those are things to think about. If there are any comments or questions, please use the virtual hand raise. I'd love to hear from folks as we take a couple minutes to look also what's in the chat on the side. We got lots of different ideas coming up. So real quickly. Yeah, Brent Christie's giving us one of Oregon State. There's a link there. Yeah, and Yvonne has added that it's, great for brainstorming, right? And again, just like I talked about putting the MAT online, there were assumptions that we thought at the time that we put into practice. There were some of those assumptions that were right, some that were wrong, and there were a whole lot of things that we didn't think about. So again, the result is it is dynamic, it is fast changing, but in order for us to remain relevant and not to become the blockbuster of faculty or programs, get in the sandbox, play with it, try to find a colleague that's willing to sort of brainstorm ideas and beat it up. Be the counter argument, right? Poke holes in it. Where would this not be good? Where could this be good? Because we are a sector, we are a domain, which is higher ed, that can have a profound influence on how things come about. And if we think about what are some of the tried and true strategies that we use day to day, there was a point in time when that tried and true strategy was not tried and true. It was someone's idea, and its original inception probably is not the way we use it now, but that's how it gets formed and shaped and molded. So that's one thing I would suggest that we all think about. Last couple items, and then we will open it to any questions. Again, you can see again the broad strokes that I went through in this evaluate, because I think we can share this deck with you later. This evaluate link goes to that Bloom's taxonomy as a way just to check it. Is this. So as this rapidly changing dynamic entity continues to grow, one of the most important things we have to think about is the accountability factor, particularly accountability and machine learning, because that's essentially what's happening is we've got an algorithm and we are teaching this thing to learn as it goes through. The training data comes from humans, the algorithm writing comes from humans, the models come from humans. Inevitably, humans have both unconscious and conscious biases. I would like to draw upon one quick example from Joan Moss. This was just recently published in AI and Society. And her assertion is, yeah, we're not going to put this thing back in the box, but we really need to think about what are some accountability frameworks that can be put into place as this tool develops in different sectors. And what she does is she uses the example of banks in granting home loans. So if you think of the original way this happened is each of us would fill out an application, we'd bring a boatload of documents, we'd cut our thumbs and press our thumbprint in blood, and we would meet with a loan officer who is seeing us, who's making a judgment, and they would spend some time crunching numbers and then come back and say, based on your risk, we are going to give you the loan or we're not. AI now is a way to expedite that. Here's the caveat. She says the developers, right, for these loan tools, the N is really small, right? But they're the developers. They're creating it. It's like, what are they thinking about in terms of what should go into this algorithm to determine do you get a loan or not. They're heavily influenced by the users, which would be the bank personnel, the loan officers who are giving input to developers, right? And the rest of us, the largest N, are the end users. But what we don't know is what variables go into that algorithm. How are they weighted? Like my current zip code, is it heavily weighted? And does that now cause me to not get a loan or to get a loan? Does my gender influence it? Is my current salary? Like we don't have any input in terms of how that happens, yet we are the recipient. So in that regard, these two groups have quite a bit of power, right? So who holds the power? What can we do? Now, granted, as higher ed folks, we're not in the loan making business, but what goes into the back end of that in terms of course creation, of teaching tools, of how we might use it to evaluate student data. So my final sort of comment or suggestion is to think about how can we be proactive to make sure that we've got our own committees at our universities thinking about accountability measures, covering IP to plagiarism to student data to how is it learning? Because one thing we do know for sure is that AI can inherit biases that are present in their training data. Like there's no way around it. And the more it goes down that road, does it become biased itself, both tacitly and overtly. So the quote unquote framework or checklist is just, again, things to think about. The resolve that it's constant and rapidly changing, and there will come a point in time when maybe it does sort of calm down or reconcile much in the way that the printing press has or the internet. Strongly encourage you to get into the sandbox. Based on the poll responses, some of you are already in the sandbox and building great sandcastles. Others maybe have not stepped in it yet. First and foremost, make sure that you are vetting and evaluating the output. Like by no means did you take it and put it out in front of students or colleagues. Like your own subject matter expertise has to be part of that. Definitely stressing AI as a complement, not a replacement for human interaction. So there's so much about what we do with students in our courses that cannot be replaced. That's got to be sacred. I already mentioned the inherent biases that can be put in there. Possibilities around changing the way students go through courses. So instead of our linear module 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, are there ways we can leverage it to change that? And lastly, making sure that we always keep an eye on what are the hands-on experiences that cannot be replaced, that can be still sacred to what we do on a daily basis. One last quote from Ross Anderson, and then we can take the last few minutes to take any comments or questions. I'll give you 20 seconds to read this. Now, Ross, as I think a little bit more of not so much a doomsday, but he did spend a few days at OpenEye's headquarters and got to see a lot of the back end. For me, it's more like just this last part, which is let's make sure that we are actively part of the conversation, at least from a higher ed standpoint. And again, from that grassroots, small committee at your own local university to maybe down the road, there are more national, international organizations around AI accountability in higher ed. I can see it happening. So that would be my last little piece there. But thank you all so much. I'm going to stop screen sharing. I will pass it over to Dr. Washington if there are any questions or other items.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Martinez. Very interesting session. I really enjoyed it. And thank you to those who participated in this presentation. I'm going to also drop a link to the conference evaluation into the chat area. You will be getting this in email as well. So if you can please fill that out. And don't forget, we have other sessions, including a closing session as well. So go forth and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.